Russia, the largest country in the world with the second largest military. Russia has been at the center of many historical frays and in recent years invaded Crimea. But what if Russia were to take further steps into Europe? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions, the channel that looks to answer precisely those and more. Big questions, small questions, flights of fancy. We're here for it all. I'm your host Rebecca Felgate, and today I'm asking, what if Russia invaded Europe? Ooh, what a concept. Before we get into this video, I want you guys to let me know, if there was a World War III, what country do you think would be the most likely to start it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below, but don't forget, play nice. It's just a question. Also, while you're down there leaving a comment, why don't you like this video and share it with a friend? And also check out the description box where we have links to all of the creative team's social media. Do stick around to the end of the video where I'm going to be reading some comments from a previous one. Okay, so Vladimir Putin makes a decision to invade Europe. Big mistake, right? Well, most likely, but before we get into the doom, gloom and booms, let's have a look at who might be drawn into the fray if Russia did push west. So at the moment, the EU consists of Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Republic of Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. Wow. Now we will get to the UK last as we know, it's pretty complicated. Primed and prepped for conflict, the key players here would be France, Germany, and Italy, who are all major military nations. We can assume that the rest of the EU member nations would support a response, drawing them into the fray. Now the key nations here, outside of the big guns, are the border nations to Russia, so Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These would be key military zones. I can only assume, despite a more neutral leaning in the past, that Finland would join the fight and be another key nation. And of course there would be Sweden, who would likely call for a peaceful resolution but would be obligated to defend the EU. Of the non-member nations, I can only imagine the Ukraine would be first in line to join the fight against Russia given the history. Turkey would also be a very key player and a great country to have on the side of the EU. Turkey borders Asia and Europe and is the first access into Bulgaria and the West. Turkey wants to join the EU at the moment, and although the path has been a bit rocky, they would likely be granted access if they helped fight this war. So, what about the UK? After Brexit, would the UK join the fight against Russia? Of course they would. Despite leaving the European Union, the UK is still part of Europe geographically, and its neighbours are its allies. The UK would be a very key addition too. Not only does it have a fantastic naval fleet, it also has nuclear weapons, although we're gonna save nukes for later in this video. Now for Team America World Police. Would they get involved? Of course they would. Europe and the US are allies, and also Russia has loads of oil, so you know. What about Russia then? Would they go it alone? It is likely that China would call for peace without wanting to lay all of its cards on the table just yet. China probably has more sense than to fight Europe, although I do wonder, what with the rest of the world distracted, who would be watching North Korea? Where would Saudi and the Middle East stand in the conflict? While an allied Europe and Russia could in theory be an equal match, or a match that Europe would win if the states joined, I wonder if Russia may have an advantage of being one centrally organized superpower against a collection of other countries who need to work together for victory. Perhaps it would try and divide and conquer. So if we're literally talking a land invasion, then I assume it would start with Russia breaching further into the Ukraine or playing about at its borders. Assuming all NATO talks and calls for peace broke down, I assume that Russia would split their military personnel of 1 million soldiers and lead invasions through the Ukraine and Poland, with soldiers surrounding the rest of their western borders, especially Azerbaijan and Georgia if Turkey were on the side of the Europeans. Geographically, issues like the Polish forest and the European Alps would make a full sweep nigh on impossible, but the Russians could gain some traction. The Russian and European military are quite evenly matched, with Europe having a slight upper hand. Europe have a high defense budget and a bigger air force, a greater naval presence, and equally impressive tanks. This is without Americans' assistance too. But do you know what Russia does have? Nukes. That's right, if we are no longer talking a land invasion and we are now in the business of discussing nuclear weaponry, then Russia, as Putin has boasted on many an occasion, can destroy all of its neighbours at the drop of a hat. With the combined nuclear force of France and the United Kingdom, Europe has under 600 nukes. Russia, on the other hand, has over 7,000, including the biggest nuclear weapon known to man, the Tsar bomber, which could obliterate an area the size of central London, or Berlin, or Paris. With the United States involved, then the fight is in Europe's favour again. But does anybody win when things turn nuclear? I am sure that the world would avoid it at all costs, but if it did happen, millions would die and millions more would get sick from the nuclear fallout, and what's the point really? Let's not forget that Russia has actually invaded Europe. In 2014, Russia invaded the Ukraine and the West didn't do too much about it. NATO did send forces to the neighbouring countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, signifying that any further aggression would be met with military force. But perhaps Russia would be sneaky. Perhaps they would invade Europe bit by bit, although why would they need to with the landmass they already have? It would be nonsensical. Russia wants to remain strong and to weaken its enemies, not own their land. It has enough. More likely, Russia would try and invade Europe, so to speak, with cyber attacks and espionage. So, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Hopefully, Russia wouldn't risk further aggression. This is one scenario, but who knows what would really happen if this went from a question to a real turn in history.
What if Russia attacks China? When the future of global politics are discussed, one of the most frequently covered topics is how America and other Western countries will deal with the recurring aggression from Russia and China in different ways across the world in the 21st century. But a question that doesn't often get posed is what would happen if Russia decided to turn its back on years of stability between the two nations and launched an attack on China. The results might not be what you'd expect. First of all, we need to take a look at why China and Russia haven't waged war since the border disputes of pre-World War I, because before those days, everyone was kind of squabbling with everyone. China and Russia are both countries known for expansion and antagonizing neighboring states, so it's curious that they so rarely showed this intent towards each other, as the two countries are neighbors in Eastern Europe. On the Chinese side of things, this may come down to the specific military philosophy that's been passed down for thousands of years regarding land that shouldn't be conquered. The idea is that if a nation has both A, its own unique culture and national identity, and B, a natural barrier between itself and China, the country is already considered a lost cause in regards to potentially expanding Chinese influence and territory. The idea is that if a country might have strong reasons for maintaining independence and their own identity, a revolution against the Chinese is inevitable, and any natural barriers such as mountains, an ocean, or impassable terrain means that China would have an increasingly hard time holding on to control in such a region if an uprising ever did occur. The Chinese military would see America's invasions of both Vietnam and Iraq to be examples of why invading such countries are bad investments. Even if victory or gains might be achieved at first, maintaining those gains will eventually get more and more difficult until you're dealing with a lost cause. So, for this reason, China has never attempted to expand into Russia during the 21st century. Not even counting the usual never invade Russia in winter advice, the dual threat of the Mongolian desert and the Altai Mountains in between the two countries means that maintaining control of Russia would be an incredibly difficult task. As for Russia's perspective, attacking one of their biggest communist allies during any of the Cold War would have been beyond foolish, and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have stayed on good terms with China. Attacking would be disrespecting a crucial ally against America and the rest of the West, and likely wouldn't end well for Russia anyways. You see, while Russia is often talked about as if it's the most notable enemy on the world stage, with its attempted hacks into the democratic process in America being a key example, its military might compared to China's is actually a little bit questionable. In terms of active military units, Russia currently only has 1,014,000 on-duty personnel at the moment, compared to China's 2.2 million, over doubling that. This gap in force becomes even wider when you consider that at least half of Russia's conscripted ground forces are not currently located in Russia, but are stationed throughout the Northern, Baltic, and Black Sea fleets and other areas of interest to Russia across Europe and the globe. Meanwhile, China's population itself is literally 10 times that of Russia, meaning if a war ever began to drag out, they would have far, far more forces that could be additionally conscripted compared to Russia's reserves. Additionally, while Russia is often lauded for the quality of its weaponry and the tech it uses to wage war, Russia is a declining superpower when compared to China, and the gap in the quality of their guns and weaponry is getting smaller and smaller by the day, to the degree that the quality of the tech would likely have very little input on the actual outcome of an extended war between these two countries. However, there is one area where the difference in tech between Russia and China might be noteworthy, and that's in regards to nuclear weaponry. China is known to have approximately 350 nuclear weapons, a scarily large stockpile until you consider that the Russians allegedly have 6,257, nearly 18 times as many. While both countries have some form of ballistic missile defenses, the sheer amount of nuclear weaponry between the two countries is intimidating to say the least, especially if you're China. In normal circumstances, nuclear weapons would likely never be used in such a close quarters war. Russia and China are literally on each other's doorsteps, and nuking your next door neighbor is going to have disastrous consequences on the health of your own people, not even taking into consideration the disastrous potential for mutually assured destruction and nuclear escalation spinning wildly out of control. If one country starts using nuclear weapons, practically every country would now consider using them as a method to contain their world-destroying potential. This is the reason that the Cold War had to remain cold, and why nuclear weapons generally aren't used in modern conflicts. However, if we are already facing a scenario where Russia is invading China, all bets are off. As a superpower that declines in stature on the world stage a little bit year by year, and with China's economic growth continuing to rise, Russia may find itself in a situation where desperate maneuvers like a nuclear attack might seem less crazy. If Russia had already committed as many troops as it could, and felt like they couldn't back down from combat with China that they themselves initiated, Russia could see their massive nuclear armory as a way to surprise and to overwhelm the huge amount of Chinese armed forces they would be dealing with on the border. This leaves China in the unenviable situation that America found themselves in during the first Cold War, not escalating Russia's aggression to the levels where it would find nuclear weapons a healthy option for victory. Furthermore, even if China is capable of pushing back the initial Russia invasion and no nuclear weapons are used, any counterattacks by China into Russian land would be difficult to pull off. Again, there's a reason that both Hitler and Napoleon found out the hard way that you shouldn't invade Russia, and that's because Russia's terrain and weather seem tailor-designed by the gods to prevent easy access by enemies. China's chances of some sort of attack or invasion in retaliation would be almost impossible, even with millions of ground forces. The terrain of Russia and the inherent advantages in holding a defensive position would mean that even with all of our 21st century advancements, war with Russia would not be easy. All the while, if both Russia and China were focused on themselves and attacking one another, this would give the United States of America an opportunity to assess the situation and decide whether intervention is necessary, or if letting two of America's current enemies fight each other winds up being better for America in the end anyways. All in all, if Russia decided to attack and invade China, it would be one of the most surprising events in modern human history, and completely change the face of global politics. New allegiances would have to be drawn, and countries around the world would suddenly be faced with the choice of whether to pick a side in this superpower conflict or remain on the sidelines and see what happens. As the war dragged on, countries could seek to take advantage of the opportunity and attempt to also attack either China or Russia, either literally with their military or simply by instating more or economic sanctions during a time of war when those actions would be most impactful. The world would be a very uncertain place, with countries needing to decide their new place in it. And no matter who wound up winning the initial war, the one thing we know for sure is that the world would be changed forever.
What if Russia attacks Canada? This is an interesting question, as Canada isn't necessarily usually at the top of the list when it comes to places that people think are going to be attacked, but as it turns out, this question might not be so far-fetched. Before we dive into allies and military powers and all of that, let's take a look at the reasons why Russia might want to attack beautiful, vast, snowy Canada. Right now, the relations between Russia and the Ukraine are now putting a strain on the relationship between Canada and Russia. Despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's denial of the war he is waging against Ukraine, it has been ongoing since 2014. It all began when Russian troops, without identifying insignia, first began takeover of Crimea in February of 2014, which is now considered a democratic state within the Russian Federation. Basically, since the fighting in Ukraine began, Russia has been claiming that it is a bystander rather than being part of the initiation of the conflict, and this is only fueling the fire more. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has expressed frustrations over this situation, and he is far from being the only one who is insisting that Russia isn't quite as innocent as they're claiming to be. During the initial months of the conflict, as the fighting moved from Crimea to the mainland of Ukraine, members of the international community began to speak up, and people had enough to feel convinced that some sanctions needed to be imposed on Russia. During this time, the International Criminal Court recognized Russia's involvement in eastern Ukraine, which then led to Russia's withdrawal from the International Criminal Court Treaty. I feel like that alone seems like some sort of an admission of guilt, despite the continuous insistence that Russia is not doing anything wrong. In March of this year, 2021, foreign ministers of the G7 nations, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US all released a joint statement which made known their impatience at Russia's attempted deceptions. The statement said, quote, "Russia is a party to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, not a mediator." It seems as though this statement came as a surprise to only Russia, considering just how much evidence has been gathered against the country. There have been many Russian soldiers captured deep inside Ukraine, and it is said that other clues are often spotted as well. It has been said that Russia's continuous denial of the reality of the situation is making any meaningful progress towards peace an impossibility. There have been many people who were involved in the offensive for Russia at the beginning of the issue in 2014 who have since provided their eyewitness accounts that detail the role of the Russian military. This, coupled with the international investigation that has surrounded the downing of Flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine, which apparently provided a slew of evidence that leads directly to the Russian armed forces, still isn't enough to persuade Putin to acknowledge the Russian involvement in the conflict. The issue here isn't even the downplaying of the situation, it's that these two leaders cannot have a conversation about how to move forward when they can't even agree on the basis of the conflict itself. If Putin doesn't acknowledge that there are even Russian forces in Ukraine, then how are they supposed to make a deal that involves the removal of these forces? This whole situation has put the international community on edge, as many other countries, including Canada, have been guilty of downplaying the scale of the Russian ambition in Ukraine, partly in fear of poking the bear and causing the situation to be worse than it already is. Things only continue to escalate, as we can all remember earlier this year when Russia had a massive invasion force ready at the eastern and southern borders of Ukraine, and now that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is complete, Russia no longer needs to rely on Ukraine's gas transit network, so who knows what kind of escalation may be on the horizon. So how is Canada directly involved in all of this? Well, since Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Canada has contributed close to $800 million in development, humanitarian, and security assistance. It is said that the Ukrainian public opinion consistently puts Canada in the top 3 friendly powers. Canada's Operation Unifier and other programs have helped to drastically improve Ukraine's military capacity. In 2014, when the conflict started, the Ukrainian military was far from prepared, drastically underfunded, and not even close to being in a state to take on the military superpower, Russia. But now, the Ukrainian military is ready. It has received consistent training and support from the Canadian Armed Forces, from things like first aid to advanced level tactics, and it is now the third largest in Europe. During this time, Ukrainian military industries have also switched their suppliers from Russia to Western suppliers of components. This just scratches the surface of why Russia would possibly want to attack Canada, although it isn't necessarily a situation that's directly on the horizon for a few reasons. If Russia were to try and attack Canada, however, it truly wouldn't be the smartest idea on Russia's part. Canada is a non-invasive target. Aside from Russia, Canada is the largest country in the world in terms of landmass. We don't have a high population, but we've got a lot of space. This makes us a terrible place to invade for many reasons. The size of the landmass alone, combined with the international distance they would need to cross, and then the domestic distances that needed to be crossed in order for an attack to be pushed inland, would simply just be too much and beyond the capabilities of most any nation. This is not to downplay the strength of the Russian military, as I am well aware that it is the second most powerful military in the entire world. It is rather just a commentary on how geographically and spatially, Canada isn't an ideal target for invasion. Canada is also a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the NATO. This is an intergovernmental military alliance between 28 different European countries and 2 Northern American countries. The whole point of this alliance is that it basically constitutes a system of collective security for all involved, because each country has agreed to a mutual defense in response to an attack on any member by an external party. This means that if Russia were to attack Canada, all NATO members would immediately declare war on the aggressor, so in this case, Russia. You know how I said that the NATO consisted of 2 North American countries? Well, the other one is the United States. And then remember how I said that Russia has the second most powerful military in the world? Well, guess who's first? The United States. Having an absolute powerhouse like our neighbors down south in our corner is a huge power for Canada if this scenario were to ever occur. Canada itself also has the ability to protect itself. We might not have the most powerful military in the world, but Canada still has access to powerful high-tech weaponry. Canada is also a top 10 economy, which means it has significant influence in terms of imposing sanctions. This is a long way of saying that not only would a direct attack or invasion of Canada be extremely hard, but defeating Canada would be even harder, especially with our allies backing us up. The NATO defense ministers have recently agreed upon a new master plan to avoid any potential Russian attacks on multiple fronts, and it is said that this strategy, which of course is kept confidential, includes preparations for any kind of attack, whether nuclear, computer hacking, or even assaults from space. Despite officials stressing that they do not believe there is any imminent threat of attack from Russia, preparations are always being made just in case. It appears as though while Russia is denying its involvement in the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, Canada and the NATO are preparing their defense in the case of emergency. So to answer the question of what if Russia attacks Canada, well, it would be a terrible time, and it truly could be the thing that sends us into a third world war. The good news is, however, it most likely won't be happening, at least anytime soon.
What if Russia invaded Japan? As 2 of the most pivotal countries in the past century of world history, Russia and Japan have a complicated relationship due to thousands of years of sharing a maritime border. But if Russia outright invaded Japan in the modern day, it could be the type of political mess that quickly spirals into the possibility of a third world war, depending on how various allies would respond. No matter what happened, however, the world would certainly be changed, and before we can figure out exactly what would happen during a modern invasion, we need to look back at the past. One of the most interesting facts about Russian and Japanese relations is that the 2 countries have still technically never signed a peace agreement to signal the end of hostilities following the end of the Second World War. This means that technically, for the past 70+ years, the 2 countries have remained at war. Numerous mentions have been made over the years of the countries finally sitting down for negotiations to write up an official peace agreement, but so far, political tactical maneuvering has prevented any true progress on that front. This is because of how the Second World War ended for Japan in the first place. Following the atomic bombing of 2 of their cities by American forces, Japan hoped to negotiate a conditional surrender with the Allied forces to prevent any further death or atomic strikes, while also hopefully allowing Japan to have some say in the state of the post-war world. Their hope was that the Soviet Union could be convinced to act as a third-party mediator between the Japanese and the Allied forces. Unfortunately for Japan, only 3 days following the bombing of Hiroshima, the Soviet Union unexpectedly declared war on Japan as well, invading several Japanese puppet states and islands. This had been Stalin's secret plan since at least 1943, where he informed his generals that Russia would enter the war against Japan as soon as their war against Germany was decisively won. The Soviet Union wasn't even aware of the Americans' atomic weapon. Their invasion merely came at the worst possible time for the Japanese forces and caused Japan to agree to an unconditional surrender, meaning they had no bargaining power in choosing how to stand down. While all hostilities were ended, Japan was obviously not keen to begin negotiating with the country that had surprise attacked them, and the issue over who can claim ownership of the islands that Russia invaded has remained as a sticking point impeding any further peace talks from being made. Every time it seems like Russia and Japan are going to sit down for the peace treaty signing photo op, negotiations are called off following a visit by the Russian government to the disputed islands in question, or some other political reason of the era. Because of all of this, even though Japan and Russia have not partaken in hostilities against each other in over 70 years, there is the possibility that Russia could use this technical lack of a peace agreement to strengthen their claim to invading Japan, and use the reclamation of these island territories as a justification for the sudden aggression. In this scenario, where Russia decided to fully claim by force some of Japan's many islands that it sees as still belonging to them, the fighting would be brutal, particularly for Japan. While Russia likely wouldn't attack the Japanese mainland directly, at least not at first, they would likely try to attack multiple islands at the same time, hoping to divide Japanese forces as much as possible. This is because Russia's largest advantage in the modern era would be the size of their army and naval forces. While Russia and Japan currently have very similar military budgets, with Russia spending $61.7 billion a year compared to Japan's $50.3 billion, the difference in actual military numbers is stark. Russia currently has 1.2 million active personnel in its military compared to only 247,000 on the Japanese side. To make matters worse for Japan, Russia has over 2 million soldiers in its reserves compared to only 56,000 reserve soldiers in Japan. While their overall populations are much closer in size, this means that Russia has far more well-prepared and trained troops than Japan could hope to muster. The only way Japan could even slightly come close to the Russians' numbers would be through a sudden mass military recruitment, which would be incredibly difficult to pull off and spread those forces out to the islands where they'd be needed in the best case scenario, or already be far too late if Russia began their invasion more stealthily and Japan did not possess much in the way of lead time. But potentially even more disastrous than the Russian invasion of Japanese islands would be the fallout that takes place across the world. Japan is currently a major ally of the United States, and would likely call for aid from both them and other NATO-affiliated countries. Japan is not a member of NATO itself, but has a long history of trade agreements and allyship with many of its member countries. These countries would need to decide whether they wish to fight back against Russia economically through sanctions and other efforts to get them to back down from their aggression, or whether to commit actual military forces to help push back Russian forces on the islands they've landed on. However, this could cause additional tensions in the Asian region, as countries such as North Korea or even China may object to Western countries sending more and more troops into the continent. Russia isn't necessarily allies with either China or North Korea, but any country could choose to take advantage of additional instability in the region and take whichever side would best benefit their home country. This scenario could easily spin out of control with conflicting peace agreements and declarations of war, exactly the type of powder keg that could wind up exploding metaphorically or literally into World War III. Russian expansion has caused a lot of alarm on the world stage in the past, but having it happen in the waters near the Asian continent brings up additional complications that even Russia might not want to instigate. If they were to invade Japan, they would need to strike quickly, decisively, and achieve firm strongholds on the Japanese islands they target, or risk having the situation spiral out of control as more and more countries become involved in Japan and Russia's conflict. Then again, if Russia has already committed more troops in the region and shown that they intend to militarily stay on their new islands, the chaos that ensues might already be impossible to stop, even if Russia did just settle for the islands on the outskirts of Japan's borders and continued to ignore the Japanese mainland. At the end of the day, Russia invading Japan is an unlikely scenario, but definitely not an impossibility, and would wind up causing a massive amount of global political upheaval if such an invasion were to occur. Between throwing the continent of Asia into chaos and forcing countries all over the world to take a side, an invasion of this scale and that involves so many potential countries could be the inciting incident that begins World War III, a scenario that none of us want to live through. So who knows? Maybe within the next few years, Japan and Russia will finally sit down and write a peace agreement to end the silent war that's technically still been ongoing for the last 70 years, and a decision will finally be made on the ownership of the islands that Russia invaded back in the 40s. What if Russia took over the world? For decades during the back half of the 20th century, one of the largest worries across America and many Western nations was whether the USSR, or Soviet-era Russia, would be capable of becoming the dominant superpower on the global stage and essentially be in control of the entire world. And with Russia still being a major player on the world stage in the modern day, alongside all of the hectic political developments of the last few years, there's still good reason to wonder as to what a Russian-controlled future looks like. Now, the idea of taking over the world is a much different concept than it even would have been during the Cold War compared to the modern era, let alone the start of the Russian Empire and legacy hundreds of years ago. Whereas in the past, Russia's goal was likely to convert as many countries as possible to the ideology of communism, thus giving them a connection with which to convert those countries into an easily controlled allied state, having a system where there are that many spread out subjects or citizens under your direct control likely wouldn't end well in the 21st century. The easy access to the internet that most developed nations now enjoy would make subjugating a group of citizens that large incredibly difficult, as they would still have easy means of communicating with both each other and easy access to outside information, which would heavily impact the effectiveness of any necessary propaganda that Russia would need to keep their new citizens believing their new Russian leadership was for the best. Whereas a conquered country in the past could have its access to outside information or independent sources practically nullified, that's a lot harder to do when there's millions of cell phones and active internet connections in the countries you're trying to take over. Trying to keep American citizens from rebelling against Russian rule whenever Russia is over 5,000 miles away would be difficult even without the internet, but put a phone in every American citizen's hands and you've suddenly got a lot harder populace to keep subjugated. But let's say that Russia was willing to put up with all of these difficulties and issues with having a singular global superpower in the 21st century. How would they actually go about taking over the world in the first place? There are two possible approaches that Russia could take, either deciding to take things slow or a quick and crippling surprise attack. The slow approach would merely be an extension of the policies that Russia already seems to have in place, and would likely begin with more firm expansions into Ukrainian territory, as Russia has been placing forces on their border with the Ukraine recently and has been having expansion-related issues with the country for several years at this point. We could see Russia making moves to bring Ukraine back into being part of their territory, although this would likely see a lot of pushback from other countries throughout the world. With how contentious the border between Ukraine and Russia already is, it wouldn't be long before economic sanctions were set against Russia by much of the rest of the world, beyond what the sanctions even are today. Countries with particularly strong ties to the Ukraine might even begin to send military troops to the region if Russia committed to this course of action, particularly the United States, who have voiced multiple concerns already about Russia's positioning of troops near the Ukraine border and likely would use the scenario as an excuse to finally exert some direct military pressure on both Russia and President Vladimir Putin. And for the countries that would choose to stay out of the Russian and Ukraine conflict, they likely would begin to have second thoughts if Russia began to invade another neighboring country and showed a commitment to expansion beyond just the Ukraine. This means that a slow and steady approach for Russia just wouldn't work. There's too many countries with their own interests for them to just allow a slow takeover by Russia of the rest of Europe, unlike earlier in the 20th century when communist allies may have been enough for Russia to make some expansionist movements without more resistance. Thus, Russia's most likely option would need to be a surprise attack and rapid expansion. If you already know that the United States is going to try and economically cripple you if you try and expand into Ukraine, do something to cripple them before you even make a move. The rise of cyber warfare and hacking has obviously been an area of great interest to Russia over the last few years, so this is an area that they potentially might have an advantage in if they decide to attack the United States or other countries such as China while beginning their expansion to take over the rest of the world. Russia is no longer the strongest military force on the planet, easily falling behind both the United States and China, and so sowing chaos and creating as much confusion and difficulties as possible to impede these governments and militaries from getting organized would be a solid first blow from Russia and could give them some time as they seized weaker countries and gained strongholds in locations that would be much more difficult for Russia's larger opponents to be able to liberate and set free from Russian control. One thing we can be sure of, no matter how Russia goes about trying to take over the world, is that nuclear weapons should absolutely not be involved. They just carry far too great of a risk for every country involved. If Russia attempted to use some of their nuclear armory to initiate a surprise attack against America, China, or even a small European nation, every other nuclear-capable state on the entire planet would instantly be on high alert, with a very real chance of atomic retaliation. Using a nuclear weapon on a populated location would be an instant dismissal of decades of military common sense, and would make any remaining countries with nuclear arms very reluctant to concede with Russia, likely causing a response of their own. This was the whole reasoning behind the coldness of the Cold War in the first place. Neither side wanted to be the first to use nuclear arms against the other because it would likely lead to mutually assured destruction, as both sides would be forced to unleash their salvos of stored nuclear weapons. If Russia was expanding at a rate where their intent was literally taking over the world, and they were willing to use nuclear arms to accomplish that goal, there would be very little preventing countries such as the United States, China, or even India from striking back directly at Russia with their own nuclear weapons in an effort to stop the rogue state before matters got even worse. If this was the case, nuclear war would cause an entirely new era on Earth, and lead to a whole new host of problems for the planet to worry about, besides the already existential threat of climate change. At the end of the day, Russia taking over the world would be a huge and risky gamble by the country, but isn't a complete impossibility. While there are many mitigating factors that would hopefully prevent a Russian expansion from overtaking the entire globe, such as the many countries that would oppose them and Russia no longer being quite the military superpower that it used to be only a few decades ago, weirder things have happened throughout humanity, and who knows where the future will take us. All we can do is keep our eyes and ears open and keep asking ourselves the big questions.